This is a sermon from Hounslow Town Church. We meet every Sunday at 9:45 in the Arts Center, located in the Treaty Center on Hounslow High Street. For more information and resources, please visit hounslowtownchurch.org.
Right. So we're exploring the life of Jesus, and today we're at the event called the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration. And to do that, to explain it, I want us to remember and recall your favorite school trip. You were in school. Surely you went on a trip away from school. Can you remember your favorite trip? I remember mine. Mine was, I was in year 9, and I was in the marching band. I played the trumpet. I no longer play that, unfortunately. But I was in the marching band, and my school band went on a school trip. I was in the north of my country, and many of you might know that in the south of my country, there's this wonderful, magical place called Disney World. And my band was invited to march down the high street of Disney World. It was the greatest school trip ever. Wouldn't that be, kids, to go to Disney World on a school trip? We went at the time of year. Well, why were we invited? Well, it was the time of year that no one went to Disney World. And so after our 1-hour performance playing at Disney World, we were able to go on all the rides because no one was there. It truly was an epic trip, epic school trip. And so I got to see Disney. I got to see all of Disney. I got to hear all that Disney had to offer. And I came to understand why everyone loves Disney. And really, that's what a school trip is about. You go away to see things, you go away to hear things, and you go away to understand things in person, by being in person. And I want to argue that's really what Jesus does here in this Transfiguration passage. He takes his students, Peter, James, and John, he takes them on a school trip in which they get to see and they get to hear and they get to understand firsthand exactly who Jesus is. Jesus has been teaching, and now in a very powerful way, he shows them. There's a voice from heaven in which they hear and they come to understand all that Jesus is. And so, as a way of an outline, it's very simple. It just follows the course of the scripture passage. We get to see who Jesus truly is. We get to listen from God to what Jesus came to do. And we thirdly get to know how to respond to him in verses 9 to 13. So first, let's consider who Jesus truly is. This is called the Transfiguration, and that's just a big fancy word which means a change in your form or appearance from one state into another, which is more beautiful or more glorious. And that's exactly what happens with Jesus. This event is the only time in the scriptures in which we see his divine nature revealed in this way. And so it really is a very unique part of the Bible. There's nothing else like it in all of ancient literature or in any other religions. This truly is a unique thing. And so here is Jesus. He takes Peter, James, and John high up onto a mountain, and he reveals to them his divine nature and his divine glory. 2 other times in the Bible, God showed his glory to humans. One time it was to Moses on Mount Sinai. God brought Moses up on Mount Sinai. The other time also was on Mount Sinai. He brought Elijah up to Mount Sinai. And so these two individuals, Moses and Elijah, they represent really two of the most significant figures of the Old Testament. Moses represents what's called the Torah, the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. And both of them saw the glory of God. When God showed Moses his glory, God said that he could only see his back. Why? Well, because no one could look into the face of God and live. if Moses saw God's face, he would have died. You see, the glory of God, it radiates from him and from God in a blinding light, such that Moses would not have been able to survive that. And yet, when Moses saw the back of God, when Moses came down off the mountain, we read in Exodus that Moses glowed, that he radiated this glory of God. Much like the moon, right, reflects the light of the sun. So when Moses came down off the mountain, he reflected a light that was not his own light, but rather it was the light of the glory of God. Here, it's different, right? Who is the source of this light? The light in Jesus, in the Transfiguration, it comes out of Jesus. It flows from him. He is the sun. There's not another sun that shines on him such that he reflects it. No. The light burst forth. This glory burst forth from Jesus. And so the meaning, guys, is absolutely 100% clear. Who is Jesus? We read it earlier. Tucker read that earlier for us. He is fully God. He is fully God. He is far more than any other prophet who would point us to God. No. Jesus is the God to whom all the prophets point. And so in this Transfiguration, Jesus shows us that he's the second person of the Trinity, that he is the Son of God, fully God, and yet we also know he is fully man. The Bible elsewhere explains this. The book of Hebrews says this about Jesus. Hebrews 1:3 says that Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact, listen to these words, the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the power of his word. I mean, this is clear stuff, right? And this is exactly what Peter, James, and John, what they saw and what they learned on the mountain at the Transfiguration. What they saw was that the one who set all things in motion, God, the one who created all things, the one who holds all things together, the one who defines reality, who defines what is right and wrong, who says what is good, who shows what is beautiful, that one, God himself, who is at the very heart of the universe, the one who is the ultimate reality, God. We see here that this God is not a power. He is not a principle. He is not a force. But rather, he's a person. He's a person who you can know, you can love, and who loves you and knows you. What this God came to do, we see here, is he came to show us his love. Listen to what God says from heaven. Listen to what the purpose of Jesus is. So secondly, the second point that we see on this school trip in which Jesus takes his students to see his divine glory, they get to hear something. And what they hear is the Father speaking from heaven. And the Father speaks, we see, in response to what Peter says. And in this little interaction between Peter and the Father, it tells us so much about what Jesus came to do, right? So here, Peter, James, and John, when they see the divine glory and they see the light shining from Jesus, well, they respond in a way I think you and I would respond. And any sane, normal human being would respond. And we see that in verse 6, and it's a response of terror, right? They're absolutely petrified. I mean, this is not normal stuff, right? Light doesn't just shine out of people normally, right? So understandably, they were terrified. And when you're terrified, what you do is you try to get away from that which is terrifying you, right? You need a shield. You need something to cover you. You need something to protect you. You need something to make you feel safe from that which is so terrifying. I'm reminded, in telling you this, I'm reminded of a time when Amy and I were on a walk, and all of a sudden, this huge dog jumped out at us. Yeah? I was on the inside. The dog was coming. We were on the road, and I was next to the grass, and the dog was coming on the grass. And I was terrified. And what does Coward Barry this is my most shameful moment ever, yeah? What does Coward Barry do? Well, I need a shield, right? So here's dogs coming this way. Amy's over here. What do? I jump behind Amy. My instinct? To make my wife the shield from this dangerous dog. As soon as I did, I realized, what kind of man am I? This is terrible, right? But that's our instinct, isn't it? To shield ourselves from that which is terrifying. To protect ourselves. That's why Peter says, let's build 3 tents. All right? This is a strange interaction here. Jesus shines light. Elijah and Moses appear. And his answer is, we need to build you 3 tents. Or another way to say that is 3 tabernacles. Or another way to say that are 3 temples. Right? What he was saying is, we need some place to shield us humans from the divine. We need protection. See, this is the story, what happens when God comes to earth. When God's on earth, when God visited his people and led his people out of slavery in Egypt in the story of the Exodus, when they were in the wilderness, he lived amongst them as a pillar of smoke and fire, as a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. And the glory was coming forth. And he lived in a tent, right? That was the place in which God could dwell, and he wouldn't consume his people. And then later, King Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem. And again, that was the place in which God dwelt was called the Holy of Holies in the temple. And there was this giant curtain, and the glory of God was behind that curtain. And that curtain and the tent and the temple were meant to protect humans from the all-consuming glory of God. So that curtain was a shield to protect us from the holiness of God. And yet here, there's no tent, there's no curtain, there's no covering. And so Peter says, let's make some tents. And God then responds. And notice what the Father says. He responds so quickly to this need to build a tent and this need to get protection. He says this. He says, this is my Son, Jesus. Listen to him. The answer, the way for man to be with God and not to be consumed by the glory and the holiness of God, to not be undone with terror, the Father says, is Jesus. Right? Jesus is the answer to how can holy, righteous, consuming, powerful God be in the presence of sinners. Right? Peter, James, and John, sinners. When sinful people come in the presence of God, they're dead. They're undone by that. You, as a sinner, cannot come into the presence of holy God. And yet, the answer, the Father says, is Jesus. Jesus is the shield for the all-consuming glory of God. He is the one who is the mediator, who stands between God and man. He is our intercessor. He will be our sacrifice on the cross. He is the way for humanity to be with God. We know this, right? On the day that Jesus died, do you know this little detail? That when Jesus was hung on the cross, in the temple, in the place of the Holy of Holies, there was a huge curtain. And that curtain was torn, saying, God and man can now dwell together because Jesus has died on the cross. Access to God is now through Jesus. Jesus tells us famously as well, right? In the Gospel of John, he says that he is the way and the truth and the life. No one can come to God except through me, he says. So we listen to these words that are spoken, and we hear that Jesus, that he came to restore the relationship between God and man, that God would no longer dwell with humanity from a tent, but rather humanity could see and be in the presence of God, face to face, in the person of Jesus. So we see God, we hear from him. Lastly, how do we respond? How do we respond? You know, it's important to know how to respond to these things. Any good school trip, if you're going to go and see things and hear things, well, you need to know what you need to do with them. And so here's how I think we're to respond. I found this helpful from Pastor Tim Keller. He says our response to Jesus in this passage should be threefold. One, we obey God because he's not tame. Secondly, we need to worship him because he's not boring. And third, we need to be patient because there's more to him than meets the eye. Right? We obey him. Why do we obey him? Well, because he's our creator. We see that clearly here. He is God, and God says, listen to him, obey him. Obey him because he is the ultimate reality of the universe. That means we are to obey him. That means that he can't be on the periphery of our life. He needs to be Lord of our lives. He needs to be at the center, right? If you are following Jesus on Instagram, you can't simply just like him. No, you live for him. You live for him. It's all or nothing. You surrender yourself fully to him, or else you surrender nothing to him. So firstly, we obey him because he's not tame. But secondly, we worship him. Why? Because he's beautiful and he's not boring. Right? The ultimate beauty we see here is love. It is Jesus losing his glory and his beauty for you. Right? Throughout the most of Jesus' life, he hid this glory in order to hang in shame on the cross. Right? The reason he didn't walk around this way was so that he could go to the cross. Do you see what that means? He's on a mission of love, right? He does that in love, and that is not boring. That's incredible. That's beautiful. And so that means that the Bible, that means the message of Jesus is not something that should put us to sleep and make us yawn. But it's something that we should get jazzed up by because it truly is the most beautiful thing humanity has ever seen. You see, Jesus, he changes then our motivation to come on Sunday morning to worship him. He changes that into a duty. Oh, I have to come. And into a delight that we get to come, that we get to worship. We get to worship this one who hid his glory in order to show us his love, in order to save us. See, that changes then. It changes our response to him. Peter, James, John, they went up on the mountain. They saw God's glory. They were terrified. They came down awed in love. See, that's our motivation. God changes. He takes away how we should respond to him in fear and terror. And instead, he transforms us so we respond to him in gladness and in joy and with gratitude. So we respond to him in obedience because he's not tame, and we respond in worship because he's not boring. But lastly, it also means that we respond to Jesus with hopeful patience. You know, the story here really is one of that tells us that God and his kingdom, that with God and his kingdom, there's always more than meets the eye, right? Only once did Jesus show us this, his glory this way. Only one time. So that means there's more to him than meets the eye. For most of his life, he hid who he truly was. And yet, he was always at work. And that should give us incredible hope for our lives, right? Because that principle that there's more to what God is doing in our lives than what we can see in front of us right now. It means that God is always at work. Even when we can't see it, he's always at work. And it means that he's especially at work in our present suffering. So what's your suffering right now? What is it that keeps you up at night? What is it that is the ache in your heart? What is it that you know is suffering? Jesus is at work in that. Listen to these words from Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. It says this, for this light momentary affliction, your suffering, your present suffering, is preparing for us, for you, an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not at the things that are seen, but at the things which are unseen, right? Jesus hid his glory most of his life. We know that about him. He's at work. So we don't look at the things that are seen that we can see in front of us right now. We know that he's at work in an unseen way. For the things that we can see are transient, meaning they're here today, gone tomorrow. But the things that are unseen are eternal. And so what is it that's hard in your life? What are your hidden fears? The things that you fear might take you down. What are those things? Is it the relationship which you fear that you'll never have? Is it the friendship which is broken? You fear that will never be mended? Is it the financial security which always seems just so out of reach? You see what this is saying? It's saying that God is always at work, even when we can't see it. But he's especially at work in those things of suffering, when we don't think he is. For he's at work in all things. Things in which we think are insignificant. Things that we know are significant. And the areas of our lives that we write off as hopeless. God is at work. So, in closing, let's go to him. Let's go to him. This Christmas, let's remember God came to earth. He hid his glory. He stepped down to be with us, to save us. So let's worship him. Let's obey him. Let's hope in him. Let's trust him. He's not tame. He's not boring. And with him, there is always far more than meets the eye.